Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Looks like we have some attendees here. Thank you for carving out a little time on your Thursday evening. Tonight we have Dr. Michael Jones, who's an entomologist with the UC Cooperative Extension, coming here to speak with us about Mediterranean oak borer. My name is Jessica Pyska. I'm the District 5 Supervisor for Lake County, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Risk Reduction Authority, which is a joint powers authority with the county, the Watershed Protection District, the cities, our tribal governments, and water purveyors. And what part of our purpose is to do education and outreach to our community about things that might be impacting our environment. We did have one in the past on bark beetles. That is up on the county's YouTube channel, but will be migrating over to the Risk Reduction Authority's YouTube channel, where this presentation will also live. So it can be used as a resource going forward. So I am really happy to introduce our good friend, Dr. Michael Jones, to begin this presentation. We will do Q&A afterwards. So if you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. All right, thanks so much.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for having me. I don't have camera, but that's okay. I usually have streaming issues if I turn my camera on. So if I get it at some point, I'll show you my face. But otherwise, I'll just have my presentation up. So, let's talk about Mediterranean oak borer. And I have other pests on here too, because this is a new invasive insect, and we're still in the early stages of understanding this pest and kind of what it means from an ecological perspective and the role it's going to play in our oak woodlands and hardwood forests. So, right, I want to really emphasize that we're really trying to learn a lot about this pest, about what this pest looks like and the kind of impacts it will have, but that there's a lot of other issues, both native and invasive pests and diseases that already exist in our systems, that we want to make sure that we're thinking about, is this Mediterranean oak borer versus other issues that we know are more common or are already part of the ecosystem. So I'll talk a little bit about what we know of what we call mob affectionately, because it's easier to say mob instead of Mediterranean oak borer every time, and then just talk about some of the other things that can look like Mediterranean oak borer infestation. So just to finish my introduction, I am the Forest Advisor for University of California Cooperative Extension, and I cover Mendocino Lake and Sonoma Counties. And my contact info will be at the end of this presentation. So if you have questions about forest management, forest stewardship, or forest health issues, please feel free to reach out. All right, so this is the insect. This is mob, Mediterranean oak borer. Its scientific name listed there is Iloborus monographus. It is an ambrosia beetle, and this is a kind of a specialized bark beetle. They're actually really cool and fascinating. We spent the whole time talking about ambrosia beetles and bark beetles, but this is an ambrosia beetle. They're very small. We call them ambrosia beetles because they have these symbiotic fungi that we call ambrosia fungi that they carry with them. And when the females start to attack new trees, she inoculates that tree with this fungus. The fungus colonizes her galleries, or the little boring tunnels that she makes in the tree. And then the fungus breaks down those really complex carbon chains that are in wood, like lignin and cellulose. And then her offspring, the larva, actually farm the fungus and eat the fungus. And so it's a pretty cool kind of relationship that they have, where they're really truly farming insects as opposed to kind of eating the wood. Other bark beetle species that are closely related to this ambrosia beetles, like your western pine beetle, mountain pine beetle, those the ones we think of more commonly, they do the same thing, except for their fungi, their ambrosia or their symbionts are in their guts, much like humans, and so they internally digest the wood, whereas these guys do externally. So it's pretty interesting, kind of cool, and as a nerdy entomologist, I'm constantly fascinated by it. The problem with these symbiotic fungi is that while they are what we call typically slightly pathogenic, meaning they can colonize and establish in the tree that the beetle is tunneling through, some of them can be fairly pathogenic, which means that they spread readily from the tunnels and start to colonize the vascular system of the tree, and then they can cause significant issues like wilts and things like that. So that's what we're concerned about in this pest complex. We call it complex because it's not only the damage of the beetle itself, but it's also the fungi that is it's symbiont that's vectoring, and they can pick up other hitchhikers that can also cause damage. So that's where we're kind of coming from when we think about this particular species. For in California, so this is, I'll talk about the zone of infestation or the area where we know it's been detected. For California, our known hosts are all oaks, and they're all in the white subgroup of oaks. So in particular, valley oak is the most susceptible, it appears, but also we found it in blue oak and Oregon white oak. That's particularly concerning. These are really important species. And so this is a new challenge. In its native range, you see, which is the Mediterranean region, which is why we call it the Mediterranean oak borer. You see cork oak as a really important host. So first detected in 2018, and really kind of centered in northern Napa Valley. Based on reconstruction of the infestation, looking at old dead trees where we found signs and symptoms that we'll talk about in a minute, we suspect that it's probably been here for a decade, which is pretty common with invasive species. Detection doesn't occur until well after establishment. We've confirmed it, and this is based on 2018, 2020 monitoring that, it was very much established in Napa, Sonoma, and Lake counties. By 2023, so a year after we first kind of built our first limitation map, our extent of the infestation, we saw a pretty rapid expansion in the area of infestation. And so the red polygon is kind of 2022, and the green polygon is 2023. And we essentially doubled the area of the known infestation, and then also confirmed a separate infestation that was not from California, but was a separate introduction to North America in Oregon. I will also point out, if you can see on the right side in Sacramento, there is the Citrus Heights community in Sacramento is also heavily infested. And yeah, there's clearly kind of some patterns of movement there that we'll talk about, but really the movement in infested material is a really important vector for this new invasive species. Last year was a very active year for this pest. Like I said, we doubled the size of the known area of infestation. We have not conducted surveys yet. We need to wait till the trees fully leaf out and really express stress once it starts to warm up and the soil's dry a little bit, and then we'll start doing our surveys to really understand if there's been a range expansion or what the current activity of the insect is. But with droughty conditions, we typically see kind of a lag in the response. But say if we have a drought in 1 year, you can expect maybe 1 or 2 years later, you'll see an increase in mortality as those stress trees become infested and start to die. So it's, if you can see on this map, it's certainly moving further in Lake County. So we started with it just in like Middletown, Cobb, and now it's in Lakeport and very well established in Kelseyville. So this is, again, the insect blown up. We have a female and a male. Don't worry too much about identification. This is more if you are going to be doing ID work or just kind of out of your curiosity. I find them kind of cute. They're about 3 millimeters, so they're extremely small. The males are much smaller. The females, as with most insects and most animal species, are the important part of the life cycle. The males just kind of hang out and mate on the tree, but the females are the ones that disperse and colonize trees and kind of do all of the big activity, which is why we typically see such a scaled dimorphism, right? So 10 to 30 females for every single male. They have multiple generations a year. We've found up to 4 generations occurring in a tree at a time. We see emergence occurring pretty much year round as long as it's warm enough, but we do have these kind of pulses tied to the warm up in the spring and kind of that first warm spell where a lot of insects start to emerge. These insects also like to pop out of the trees and kind of take advantage of the warm conditions and the trees that are moving lots of resources as they're flushing foliage and kind of waking up from the winter. And I say possibly second generation, so meaning that, like I said, we find multiple generations, but this is what we're kind of seeing sometimes, and it's highly variable, but we're seeing maybe a second emergence event later in the year, which might be related to another generation emerging from that tree. But the real big kind of takeaway from the flight data that we've collected and kind of their emergence data is they're constantly flying. Just for example, about 2 weeks ago, I was standing at a site for a completely unrelated meeting, and a female landed on me, and I was like, oh, okay, there we go. So they're constantly flying around when it's warm enough. Don't worry, again, too much about this, but I just want to point out, and we'll talk about other pests, that there's a lot of insects associated with oaks. Oaks are very resilient and very tough trees, and they're well adapted to kind of the climate we live in. But that does not mean that there are not a series of insects that like to feed on stressed oaks. So when we do trapping and when we do monitoring and work with collaborators and landowners, there's a lot of other insects that we detect. A lot of them are smaller, but very similar. So Xyloborus monographus is mob in this top center. All these other species are native or introduced species of ambrosia and bark beetle that also attack oaks that we find with oaks. So this is a very complex relationship and association for these pests. Mob is unique in that it attacks still living trees, where a lot of these other insects occur in heavily stressed and declining and even dead oaks. There's also a whole suite of larger species. So here's mob at kind of the top left. And you see that there's also kind of a pretty big suite of insects that feed on dead dying oaks that are much larger, but kind of similar in shape. So this is just to point out this is not an easy, it's not easy to say, hey, there's something going on in this tree, it's mob. There's a lot of factors that could be at play, confusing and making the detection of this insect much more complicated. Just kind of more fun, and this is really helpful because actually you can ID this insect with your naked eye, maybe even with like a little hand loop that most eye naturalist folks or gardeners already have. So the beetle is kind of elongated and straight sided, so meaning it's kind of like I don't know, rectangular. It's shiny, which is not too much of a characteristic for insects, but yeah. Straight sides, shiny. Remember, the females are 3 millimeters. And then the declivity, which, just for lack of a better term, their butt, essentially. This is their elytra, which is a hardened casing covering their wings. This sloping area in the back, and I call it their butt because it's easier, is flattened. So it's very flat. You can see from a top view how flat it is. You can see that with your naked eye. It's pretty obvious. And then most importantly is if you see these two pairs of projections, we call these tubercles. They're basically just like little knobs that grow out of the elytra, but there's 2 pairs. So there's 4 of them that kind of appear in a box. And you can see that almost with your naked eye or with like a 10 power loop. And that is very characteristic of a mob and separates it from other ambrosia beetles. So if you're ever doing ID work or if you're concerned, yeah, there's easy ways to confirm infestation and confirm the beetle's identity. So let's talk about signs and symptoms. And I just want to point out, you likely will never see the adult. They're so small that they're hard to detect unless you're trapping for them or you're specifically trying to collect them. But that's just some information. So kind of how we look for them and how, if you are doing, the monitoring, you will be able to look for them yourselves. So signs and symptoms. So the most obvious and, often the first thing that we recognize that a tree might be stressed or declining is we look for branch decline. Because this is a small insect, it interestingly enough, or not surprisingly, starts in the upper canopy in the smaller branches. And so sometimes we might see branch-specific decline relative to the rest of the tree. As the infestation progresses, meaning as the populations build up and the beetles keep reinfesting the tree through time, we see that they're spreading through the upper canopy down in the main stem, and that progression creates further decline. So early signs of infestation might be branch dieback, more advanced infestation, you see the entire canopy kind of discoloring and fading. And then eventually branches might start failing. We'll talk about in a second, but their galleries, their tunnels that they drill structurally weaken the tree, and that can cause branch failure. So they drop from the tops. And so you can kind of look at those two for confirmation. But these are basic first signs that you look for. And to be clear, this is not unique to mob, right? A lot of things can cause canopy decline and branch dropping. So we'll talk about some of those, but this is kind of what we first cue into an area. Once we see a really heavily infested tree, for example, in the bottom left, that's a tree that, that canopy is 95% dead. Then we start to see that the beetles have started to infest the main stem. And so when you look at the lower bowl or the main stem of the tree, you see boring dust, which is as they tunnel into the tree, they kick out all of the kind of dust that they create, right? As they're chewing through that wood, they're excavating and kicking out. So we call that boring dust. And you can see that on the bark of the tree. And so it's just this fine powder that covers the whole tree. Sometimes bacterial infections get established in those tunnels. And so we see like staining. Not as common, but certainly during the wet time of the year, we see staining. But the boring dust on the main stem is a really unique thing, especially if the canopy is still green and you see boring dust on the stem. That's a pretty significant determination that it's probably mob. Typically, by the time we see these symptoms, the tree is on a trajectory of declining mortality. There's not much we can do about keeping it alive. When you look at galleries, so these tunnels, which are really important for insect identification, here's how I was talking about their structure. As they bore into the tree, they mine through the sapwood, sometimes in the hardwood, depending on the size of the tree. But these little black lines are the galleries, right? They're little tunnels that they've inoculated with their ambrosia fungi. So that's the fungus that's causing the black. And you can see how it's all kind of on the same plane. And that kind of everything occurring in the same plane really really weakens the structural integrity of that branch, especially because they're breaking down all of the structural carbohydrates. And so you can see branches like this in one in particular fail. When you look at the main stem, all these little shot hole pattern in a line, those are all galleries going into the tree. Here's a close-up. And then on large stems, we see that the galleries really penetrate just the sapwood. They don't get too much in the heartwood. There's not a lot of nutrients there. That's kind of the waste material. But it highly depends on the size of the tree. But these are, when you see these kinds of patterns of galleries in wood, it's a very clear, there's not much else that can cause this particular kind of pattern. Don't worry too much about this information, but as I mentioned, there's lots of other species that can cause galleries and that are bark beetles or ambrosia beetles that are very similar to Mediterranean oak borer. And so just that's something that we have to pay attention to when we're looking. And so if you see blackened galleries on branches or some kind of evidence of insect attack, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's mob. It might be a native species, for example, that's working on decaying a dead, dying oak. And this is really important because, we're trying to really understand the expansion rate of this infestation and what are susceptible hosts or the conditions in which we create susceptible hosts. And so we want to make sure that we're very specifically assigning symptoms and decline to mob as opposed to just kind of things that occur in the background from other types of stressors. So that's why we're paying attention to the long list of native insects in this space. Management. And so where would we go from here? And we have this insect, it's kind of spreading fairly rapidly. We still don't understand entirely its role in the ecosystem, whether it can kill healthy trees or if we're just finding it in already stressed trees. So if for example, some of our sites in Napa are in fire footprints. And so are we seeing, does it respond to fire? Do we see heavily infested trees and fire footprints because of that initial stress? And we are seeing some kind of a positive relationship. It's not a strong one, but we are seeing that, hey, fire stress trees do seem like they can be more susceptible, especially the blue oaks and the Oregon white oaks. But in the urban spaces, really where we see a lot of these issues, in the urban trees, in the urban forest, it always seems like there's predisposing stressors that have already weakened that tree significantly, and mob is just taking advantage of that. So I don't know if that's good news or not, but it certainly is important thinking about its impact, because if they're just attacking heavily stressed trees, and that means that we can do things like improving tree vigor or improving management in general that can help slow the rate of spread and protect high value trees. So at this point in time, the big emphasis on monitoring. So using traps to monitor the rate of spread, trying things like using remote sensing data, or drones to kind of monitor forest health, canopy health in the forest. But based on a lot of other invasive insects that we've worked with and that are kind of established in California, we know that a lot of the time, one of the most important things we can do is to improve vigor, right? To keep those trees healthy and improve for lack of a better analogy, their immune system so that they're more resistant or tolerant, or however you want to kind of say it, but they can withstand or avoid being infested and declining from invasive insects. So when we say supplemental watering, I'm not suggesting that we start watering in the middle of summer. That's not very healthy for oaks, but maybe we're stretching out the rainy season to give them a little bit more water to help improve their health and make them that much more vigorous. Mulching the soil under the drip line to help retain soil moisture and keep more moisture in the ground, keep the roots from drying out. And thinning, right? Each tree is a straw on the ground. If we can thin the number of trees in an area, say you have fir encroachment or some kind of other issues or other species that are growing around large oaks, and this pest likes valley oaks and it likes very large valley oaks. So a lot of times the trees we're seeing dying are those 3-4 foot diameter valley oaks that are these beautiful heritage trees in the urban spaces, and they're the first ones to die. So maybe reducing competition in those spaces to keep those trees healthier. Maybe we're trying pruning to kind of reduce the dead material or damaged material to create less susceptible, less attraction to that tree. And then perhaps, most important, and we know this because it's very common with invasive insects, is not moving infested material. And I know that can be challenging because of where we have our greenway sites, and maybe we use firewood, but really being cognizant of where firewood comes from and where potential pest and disease issues might be in that space and where we're moving it. And we know for a fact, like I mentioned, that Sacramento has an infestation, and there's really only way they got there was that somebody took infested material from the Napa area or Lake County or Sonoma and drove it to Sacramento, right? And then the pests emerged and they infested those trees. So moving firewood or infested material is a real significant risk. Further exploring management, thinking about integrated pest management. A lot of the guidelines that we have on our website, which I'll list at the end of the talk, are based off of kind of the shot hole borers, which is another invasive ambrosia beetles, two invasive ambrosia beetles that are introduced into Southern California. They're very similar. I guess you could call them cousins, if you will. And so maybe while we haven't tested all of these IPM strategies, because of their similarity, it seems like they're probably pretty good options for long-term management. But mechanical, meaning, hey, look, if we have infested material, we know that they can emerge from cut wood or slash or biomass that's removed from a site, then we need to think about destroying it. So can we chip it, grind it, burn it? How can we destroy that material to kind of kill those beetles and keep them from emerging or surviving the processing? Can we tarp wood, put it under, so we call it solarization? Can we cure it, dry it out faster, or cause emergence to happen and capture those beetles as they emerge? We're still exploring that. It doesn't seem like that's a very viable option, especially considering the volume of wood that's created when you cut down a very large valley oak. But it's something that people who need firewood and who have a few other options, it's maybe a viable tool. And then also, in addition to the cultural perspective of not moving infested material, mechanical treatments, and then lastly, chemical treatments. And we haven't tested these at all, but presumably, if you have an insect, using an insecticide that's injected in the tree can work. And then if you have an insect that relies on a fungus, then using a fungicide as well can help kind of control the growth of the fungus, which would control the growth of the insect. So thinking about those options moving forward as well. We have not tested this on Mediterranean oak borer, so I don't recommend this yet as a treatment. Some people are trying it, and there has been some success with these other invasive species. So while I don't recommend it, it certainly is up to the land manager, landowner to decide their approaches. And so these are options. All right, so that's what we have for mob. It's not a lot because it's the new pest and we're still trying to learn a lot about it. Let's look at some other oak pests that we can occur in these systems, in these ecosystems, and also have very similar symptoms to mob that we can confuse for mob or that might mask mob infestations as well. This one is perhaps not necessarily overlapping with mob, but this was just an interesting infestation that I noticed and isn't a serious one, but it was kind of cool. The two-horned oak gall wasp kind of had an outbreak this winter and spring. It's mostly on live oak, so there's not a lot of overlap. But I got a lot of concern that this was mob, but you can see in this photo on the right, the tree on the right, the canopy looks very faded. This tree on the the left side of the road is very faded. The right side of the road is healthy. It's these tiny little snippet wasps. They're actually pretty cute. They create these little two-horned galls, hence the name. But they cause a lot of discoloration and dieback, and so there's a lot of concern that people thought mob was super active over the winter. But yeah, right. So this was in live oaks, not necessarily the same as associated with us that are not hosts for mob. Certainly, live oaks can be hosts for other diseases like sudden oak death that we'll talk about in a second, or gold spotted oak borer. But in this case, it was just an outbreak of a gall wasp that there's no real control for. The populations have already collapsed and disappeared. No idea where they went, but it was interesting, kind of temporary, big, noticeable change. There's lots of oak gall wasps that can cause weird patterns. Again, decline of the canopy maybe, or stressors in the canopy, not necessarily something to be concerned about, but can certainly cause a little head scratching thinking about what's causing that damage. Acorn pests, again, maybe not necessarily super associated with mob, but a lot of questions when acorn pests infest acorns. They can introduce a bacterial infection causing drippy nut. So there's a lot of questions like, hey, there's all this sap pitching on from my oak tree on my car, like honeydew from aphids. What's happening? And that can create some concern that maybe there's a bark beetle infestation in the canopy. But really, in this case, it's just acorn pests causing all kinds of funky things. So again, kind of a short-term temporary problem, but something that can be concerning for landowners and managers. Just a plug for myself, even though I'm already here plugging myself. Acorn weevils are ridiculously cute. They're fascinating. I worked with KQED. They have an online program called Deep Look. I worked with them to help produce one of their short little vignettes on acorn weevils. So I highly recommend you look it up. It's a really fun kind of video. So these are, now we're getting some serious things that can cause significant oak decline that might be associated or completely separate from Mediterranean oak borer. And so a big one is oak root rot or armillaria. Really common across a lot of oak species and even into other hardwoods and conifers. It's a pathogen, especially in the urban spaces where oaks are overwatered and lawns. And this can definitely be a stressor that would create conditions for a Mediterranean oak borer to kind of establish in a tree. With armillaria, you see the fine roots are kind of eaten by the pathogen, and that creates structurally weakened trees that can fail. And really the way we manage for this is, again, improving that vigor, right? Improving the health of the tree, avoid overwatering, especially in the middle of summer when the pathogen is particularly active, avoid creating injuries, which creates pathways for the pathogen to get into the tree. But, this can cause canopy decline, tree failure, things that can look a lot like mob or can create the conditions in which mob will successfully colonize the tree. There's just basic things like storm damage where branches break over winter. They cause discoloration. It looks like it could be flagging in the canopy from insect damage, but really it's just that branch dying out. These are things, and I want to point out, these are things that these are all related to questions where when we were talking about mob last summer, I got a lot of questions like, what's wrong with my tree? And these are based on some of the things that we identified as people were concerned with mob. So just simple branch breakage from storm damage. Western oak bark beetle, this is a native insect, kind of occurs across all oak species. It just is opportunistic on drought-stressed trees. Similar signs of symptoms, you get boring dust and you get galleries. The problem is, or I guess not the problem, but really this insect occurs during high drought stress, which also is a good condition for Mediterranean oak borer. So kind of identifying this pest from mob is going to be important. Again, improving vigor. You can do things like sanitation, pruning to kind of remove infested branches. But a couple of years ago, we had some pretty big outbreaks in little pockets that killed otherwise, healthy trees. The big challenge with this pest is that vector is an invasive pathogen. And this is what I was talking about earlier with ambrosia beetles, is they can pick up hitchhikers that then can be more pathogenic than their symbiotic fungi. This particular insect picked up a pathogen called foamy bark canker, which they can inoculate in this black oak. Every time a bark beetle attacked this tree, even if it was successful, it inoculated that tree, and all that collective damage kind of weakened the movement of nutrients in water and eventually killed these trees. So that's a big challenge with Western oak bark beetle. Even though it's native, it's vectoring an introduced pathogen. which, is challenging from a management perspective. Again, if the tree is stressed enough that Western oak bark beetle's in there, maybe Mediterranean oak borer is there already, or it can show up as well. So we can see some native insects creating conditions for mob outbreaks, or mob creating conditions for native insects to outbreak. Branch dieback, this is like diplodia. Typically, this is just flagging in the canopy. So remember when I said early signs of mob infestation is just in the upper canopy. And there's lots of things that can cause just single branches or twigs to die back. So branch dieback is super common. I see it all the time. It occurs particularly in black walnut, close live oak, and valley oak. Again, it can be aesthetically pretty significant, but it just ultimately is just an aesthetic issue. It doesn't really impact the health of the overall tree. And again, well, I guess this is a very common practice is vigor, right? Keeping your tree healthy and making sure that it has the kind of resources and the capacity to protect itself from these pathogens and these insects. Twig blight, similar to branch dieback, except for this occurs at the twigs, and you see those small clusters. I'm sure we've all seen it, where you see just like clusters of leaves that have yellowed and discolored. It's because the twigs themselves are getting infected with this cryptocline or discula, and it's causing dieback. This is a pretty significant example in this photo. Again, aesthetic, vigor. There's some literature, if you go way back, we're using fungicides. I don't recommend it because they said you needed to mix it with diesel, which is not a thing we do anymore. We do not mix our chemicals with diesel and apply them to trees. It's just not a good idea. It worked really well, but as you can imagine, there's probably lots of unintended consequences from using a pretty significant petroleum product and spraying it all over your trees in your forest. And then pruning, right? If these are really significant infestations, you can prune them out. But vigor, it's really about we had a fairly, well, I can't speak across the board, but we had a pretty average rainfall this year, and it's still a little wet out, some late rains. That's pretty good for the oaks. And even now, if you want, getting them a little bit more water is going to give them a boost. So anything we can do to help them get through the hot, dry parts of the year is going to improve their vigor. Here's a big one. Sun oak death is an invasive pathogen, not going to be as big of an issue throughout Lake County. It's in the county, definitely on the southwest corner on Mount St. Helena and the Napa border, where there's tan oak and lots of California black oak. So again, thinking about moving infested material from known infestations, there's still over 100 native species in California that a lot of them occur in Lake County. And so it certainly can pop up probably in wetter areas or in certain spaces within the county. So definitely being cognizant of the fact that, this can wreak havoc in these ecosystems as well, and spreads very similar to Mediterranean oak borer. And what I will make notice here is that sun oak death, the true oaks that actually die from sun oak death are in the red intermediate subgroups, which is opposite of Mediterranean oak borer, which attacks the white subgroup. So there's very little risk of them overlapping. But again, the unfortunate news is that we now have invasive species across. Right? There's invasive species that can attack all of our oaks, our native oaks in California now. And that's the big news about Mediterranean oak borer, is that the white oaks were the last subgroup that didn't have an invasive pest of noticeable impact, and now we do. So mob and sod, that's fun, aren't going to overlap, but that maybe plays into thinking about long-term management of what do you do if you have these invasive insects and pests and diseases that can impact a lot of our native oaks. Again, with sod, it's just about monitoring and not moving infested material, right? It's really paying attention to knowing where you're infested, where your wood or your material is coming from and where you're going with it. There's a lot of other insects that cause flagging and branching that kind of pop up, and some years they're bad, some years they're not. But the point is that there's hundreds of insects that feed on oaks that can cause symptoms and signs that might look like mob. So it's really important at this stage that we're really differentiating out whether it's a new invasive insect or something that's kind of part of a natural ecosystem disturbance regime, which these disturbance agents that we're talking about are actually really important for the health of the ecosystem, especially when they're part of the native populations that have kind of built into this coevolution of history with the trees and help kind of create heterogeneity in forest structure. It's the invasive insects that we're separating out from this ecological cycle and focusing on, how significant is their impact and how do we manage for them. Mistletoe, I just want to point this out because a lot of times you get questions about mistletoe. broadleaf mistletoe, it's killing my tree. And it's not, it's a hemiparasite, which means it's not killing the tree in that sense. It's really it's like scaffolding, right? It's birds eat the berries, they defecate the seeds on the tree, and then the seeds emerge, and then the broadleaf mistletoe establishes in that tree. So that's why you see on big trees where birds like to perch, it's not killing those trees. Typically, those trees are already declining, decaying, they're old and senescent, and we're just seeing kind of what is a secondary kind of symptom of an already stressed tree. And then lastly, just overall, when trees get older, they start to senesce. So age-related, urban stressors, these can all be really important factors in kind of the health of the tree. So it may not be that we have a particular pest or disease issue. It may be the tree's immune system is just breaking down as it gets older, and we're seeing more signs of decline. So these trees in this photo, I wouldn't consider unhealthy. They're just old, and they certainly have their own management risks and hazards, but I would not specifically say, hey, this is mob, we need to worry about this. It's just as we need to think about management of this tree, but in a different kind of context. And then, of course, development, construction, other things that we do when we cut the root systems of a tree, or we mess with the tree's kind of critical root zone, we can kill those trees, even if there are no pests and diseases available, right? We can just literally shut off the pathway of water nutrients, which can lead to mortality, which can look like mob or other types of issues, but at the end of the day, it's not really tied to any particular pest or disease. It's really tied to our management of that space. So paying attention to kind of construction in those places where we can kill trees, even if we're not worried about invasive pests. All right. Lastly, pests on the horizon. And we need to think about, this is a big one. Gold-spotted oak borer. It's established in Southern California. It was introduced here on firewood from Arizona. It attacks those red subgroup of oaks again. It's slowly working its way north, and unfortunately, the risk map suggests that the entire range of live oak and black oak and canyon live oak in California are susceptible. Lake County, I think, is probably a pretty good host, or the environment in Lake County is probably a pretty good place for gold-spotted oak borer, and so I think it's something that definitely we need to think about the potential risk for in the county. Again, it's not going to overlap with mob, but right, remember, it's going to interfere. It's going to take the red subgroup, and then mob's going to be working on the white oak subgroup. And so we're going to think about what does that mean from a long-term management, stewardship, and persistence of the oak woodlands. Don't worry too much about this. It's very unique in its symptoms. The D-shaped exit holes are a giveaway, and we can talk about that more later. But be aware that this kind of pest, it may not happen overnight. It may take a long time. It may never happen, but this is an important one to keep an eye on as well. And if you notice, big one is don't move firewood, right? We know that's just an important vector. All right. I hope that wasn't too much. Here we go. We'll do some questions in a minute. This is my email if you need to contact me. If you want all the information we have on Mediterranean oak borer, check out the website MOBPC, which stands for Mediterranean Oak Borer Pestcomplex.org. And that is, that's the website we've set up, and we'll still need to update it, but all the information I talked about plus more is there. And so it's a good source to go to. And then for all things oaks, if you have questions, the UC Oaks website, which is just type in UC Oaks in your search bar, will take you to that resource for information on oaks. With that, and of course, don't move firewood. And with that, I guess I'll stop sharing. And if there's Q&A or if there's questions, I guess, Jessica, we're ready for that. Yeah.
Okay, I can't get my video back on, but we can do some questions. We do have a question in the chat, but I just wanted to ask first, Mike, what do folks do if they suspect they have mob on one of their trees or somewhere in their property?
Yeah, that's great. So reach out to me. Hey, just kind of as a courtesy notice, maybe if you're emailing me, CC the county ag commissioner as well. And I'll follow up with my research team, which is CAL FIRE. And for a while, we had CDFA was also involved. They're kind of in the background, but we will follow up with that. It's confirmed in Lake County, so it's not going to change anything too significant, but we can go out and confirm your infestation and kind of talk about what your options are moving forward.
Okay, great. And I think we have Catherine on the Zoom today too. The Ag Commissioner, Catherine Vanderwall, her department has been part of this monitoring project several years ago. So it is important to keep her in the loop too if you have any of these suspicions. And Elisa said my camera should work now. Maybe. Nope, still not working. Okay, so I'm glad that Kevin Solon joined us. And his question, Mike, I don't know if you want to read it. It's kind of long, but Kevin is the forester that's been hired with the RCD who is based out of San Diego. And so his question is about the gold-spotted oak borer causing significant mortality across SoCal. So we're learning there might be a decline in tree radial growth associated with early onset, but no change in leaf spectral signature. Long-term monitoring with high-res multispectral and LiDAR data could identify early onset infestations and help mitigate mob. Is there an area within Lake County that would make a good steady site for monitoring mob with remote sensoring data? And if so, we should chat.
Yeah, certainly, Kevin, and I'll just briefly address this because I actually was just on a call with NASA and JPL and CAL FIRE and some folks down in SoCal talking about building remote sensing capacity for detecting early stage GSOB infestations. I've been involved in at least 3 invasive species, so emerald ash borer, gold spot oak borer, and now Mediterranean oak borer, where we've tried to use remote sensing as a tool for early detection. Currently have a research project in Napa looking at, we started with remote sensing satellite imagery, high resolution imagery, and now we're flying drones, not with hyperspectral, but with RGB and multispectral to try to develop detection models. And I will say that in all efforts I've been involved with it, I don't think fail is the right word because there's always room to kind of keep exploring, but it's incredibly difficult to tie a specific pattern of decline to a particular insect. So we can certainly detect for changes in canopy health, right? We can certainly see that stress across the canopy, even with orthoimagery and especially in hyperspectral. But being able to specifically tie it to a pest has been challenging. So we're still exploring that with mob. We can certainly talk about future research projects and if you want to explore that avenue, but I don't know how hopeful I am right now on that. But it's certainly as a tool for monitoring health of the canopy in the urban forest and in important wildland areas. Drones can be a really important tool for getting that kind of helping you focus your boots on the ground, your kind of ground truthing to really determine what's causing that decline. But yeah, let's talk more if you want to reach out.
Great. And I think that Kevin will be making a trip up here soon, so I hope you guys can connect. Do we have any other questions in the chat? It doesn't look like we have any at this moment, but I'll give it another minute. Oh, we have one from Director Turner. I'm thinking about conditions that Community Development Department can add to discretionary projects regarding proposed tree removal. It seems it might be helpful to make sure that those trees do not leave the project parcels in case they are affected. Do you have any other ideas on how Lake County can make helpful changes? And I think she means the county of Lake.
God, this is such a great question, one that we've been struggling with, and I'm going to throw some organizations under the bus right now because I think this is a place that I can do that. When we first detected mob, it was right in the midst of a particularly large local utility company's efforts to do enhanced vegetation management and post-fire cleanup, and they were removing infested oak material from the core of the infestation and transporting it outside of the known infested area to areas where they were legally allowed to dispose of green waste and process it. And we have direct links to that creating a new infestation. So I absolutely, it's not realistic to expect small landowners to keep large trees on their property. It's just, that's not something that we can ask them to do, right? When you have a 4-foot diameter valley oak that you have to take down, that has a ton of biomass that you can't just expect them to leave in their yard. So I think what we have to decide is how do we create green waste sites where we can process the material quickly, meaning can we destroy it or whatever it is we have to do to kind of cure it to remove the pest risk, can we create micro sites or greenway sites that are in neighborhoods that people are accepting of, and we can put the equipment like curtain burners or chippers in those spaces to process the wood locally, encourage chipping days, encourage people to bring material there, encourage firewood trading programs. So if you cut down a valley oak and you want to use it for firewood and it's going to be on your property, that's great. But if you want to move it somewhere else, hey, can we have a trade program where you bring all that wood to this site and we have some sanitized firewood that we can trade you with? So thinking about creating local scale disposal sites and ways of processing that material is really important to minimize the spread, because we can't expect people to not, for a lot of these small mountain communities that rely on firewood for heat, we can't expect them to not move wood. We just have to make it less accessible or kind of encourage better stewardship. And I know that's challenging because, for example, in Napa County and in Sonoma County, a lot of the times the only places that you can put green waste disposal sites is an industrial class land, and that's not always accessible or close by to where you're working. And so how do we come up with creative solutions to deal with this biomass that we're going to create is going to be really important. So I don't know, to answer your question specifically, I don't know what that would take. Maybe in Lake County, it'd be a little bit easier. I know working with Jessica on the bark beetle mortality, she's made some amazing things happen with, through her efforts and with support from the county and your roads crews and your maintenance crews. So maybe there's opportunity to kind of think about where are hot spots in the county, like Kelseyville and Middletown and maybe Lakeport now, and how can we keep the wood local to that space and kind of process it in those areas. And a big part of that is education. So, that Don't Move Firewood campaign, burn it where you buy it, kind of really doing outreach and education to the tree care workers and the professionals doing this work and helping them understand the risks from moving this infested material is key as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mike, because that is one of the things that the Risk Reduction Authority is working toward. We're kind of just in the beginning phase of building out our whole biomass strategy, and we are getting support from the state as we get into this pilot program. But that is one of the goals. We do want to have multiple sites around the county for disposal, but you're right, we've got to get to it really quickly. Make sure that it's processed efficiently and we're not contributing to the spread. So I really appreciate that question, Maria. Thank you so much. And we're going to keep working toward that goal. We have a question from Peter Hess. Mike, how do prescribed burns in oak woodlands affect the incidence and vigorous of particular pathogens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And fire, even prescribed fire, though we try to keep fire intensity low to minimize that damage, fire is a stressor for trees, and it can create wounding or enough water stress or some kind of impact to the trees that can potentially make them more vulnerable to future pest and disease issues. So when we're thinking about prescribed fire, which, Peter, you and I, we work on this a lot, is that if we're thinking about improving the health of an oak woodland, it might not be appropriate to do a prescribed burn on drought years, right? We may want to link our prescribed fires to really, I don't even know how to say average. It's not even a thing anymore, right? Nothing's average with the way our weather behaves. But on maybe wetter years or years where we know that the trees are going to be able to recover quicker because there's more moisture, or maybe because we're actively managing them. But if we're burning on in the middle of extreme drought conditions or persistent drought conditions, we're going to further stress those trees and make them vulnerable to not only invasive pests that might be in that space, but the native insects are also going to take advantage, right? They thrive in post-fire footprints. That's their role. Their role is to decompose those complex carbon chains and recycle them back into the ecosystem. And they're fire specialists. They all show up after fires in fire-stressed trees. So we really need to think about those relationships and those interactions of disturbances and what kind of impacts those could have. And I think that's an important part as we scale up other types of management practices, how these interact. So yeah, that's a good question, and something that I can't specifically say because we haven't had that interaction yet where we've burned prescribed fire with Mediterranean oak borer, but we did in both in Napa that they did do some backfiring and burning during the glass fire. And in those spaces where some of the trees got a little bit hotter, we are seeing mob in those fire stressed trees. So certainly think we can have the same conditions under prescribed fire
Okay, and he says, thanks, Mike. I read that broadcast burns can kill the pathogens in the soil itself.
Yes and no, right? If it's hot enough, you can the sod forms these like clematospores, which are these like drought resilient little things that persist. They're crazy. You can destroy the pathogen through heating and by it's really about burning off the infected green material. So you don't eliminate though, right? Because the areas that don't burn, the green biomass that's still infected, that stays alive, just kind of reinfects the new flush of foliage and the new flush of growth of susceptible hosts. So you don't necessarily eliminate it, but we are thinking about, and this is some research programs that we're exploring, is if we can use prescribed fire to slow the rate of spread by reducing the propagule pressure and kind of managing to basically kind of control the pathogen to some extent. That doesn't work the same way for bark beetles. Bark beetles are protected under the bark of trees. You have to basically heat the heck out of a tree and consume a lot of the wood to kill them when they're that deep under there, especially things like ambrosia beetles, which go into the sapwood. So they're kind of protected and they can emerge and then quickly find stressed trees in that space. So it really, how you use fire to improve forest health, I think really depends on what pests you're trying to control and you're managing for.
Okay, well, that's all of our questions. I really appreciate you, Mike, coming out on this evening and helping us through this. We've been wanting to do this for a long time. The Risk Reduction Authority is now in a place where we've got funding. We can start to do this type of outreach work again. I want to give a big thanks to Elisa Robinson. She is with Jade Collective, who is supporting the RCD these days and also the Risk Reduction Authority. So again, this recording will be uploaded to the RRA's new YouTube channel, so you can access that. Mike, you also did a town hall on the bark beetles a couple of years ago. We're about to start hopefully getting our hazard tree removal project off the ground in the next couple of months. So it's taken a while to get to this point, but we have not stopped working on it. And Mike, you have been incredible in your support with all the research that you've done and helping advise the County of Lake on how to move forward, and with so many of our nonprofit groups too. So I want to give you a huge shout out. You've been nothing but helpful to all of us. We really value your expertise and your support. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you for all the attendees. And everybody have a wonderful night. Thanks so much. Bye.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really great working with the county. You guys you're really responsive and engaged. So that's really it builds confidence in this effort, right? It's great to work with you all. So thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.